There are some who can live without wild things, and some who cannot. Like winds and sunsets, wild things were taken for granted until progress began to do away with them. For us of the minority, the opportunity to see geese is more important than television, and the chance to find a pasque flower is a right as inalienable as free speech. These words sum up the driving force behind one of the most remarkable men of the 20th century. Aldo Leopold, a man whose life and writings were to change and still are changing the face of history. A prophet whose voice we are just beginning to hear clearly. It is rare when a person makes major contributions across the whole spectrum of an area of human knowledge. Not even Einstein or Darwin were able to do that. But Aldo Leopold did. The subject was ecology, the study of living organisms and their environment. In his own way, Leopold would transform the old nature study, the endless classifying of organisms, into the study of the dynamic relationships between plants, animals, soil, water, and perhaps most importantly, man. Born in 1887, Aldo Leopold grew up at a time when people believed that civilization, progress, and wild things were incompatible. If his life had a special meaning, a unique purpose as he saw it, it was to demonstrate that this supposed incompatibility between civilization and nature was false, and that in fact progress carried to the extreme would threaten human existence itself. Aldo Leopold was no mere birds and butterfly man. He completely immersed himself in the new subject of ecology, so much so that some would call him the father of it. As a young man, we would have seen him fighting for the acceptance of the idea that forests can be continuously productive, that the plow does not have to follow the axe. In the 1930s, he was at the forefront of the struggle to develop and implement necessary soil conservation practices, such as contour farming. As Leopold said, what good is it to win the battle in the legislature and lose the one on the back 40? At a time when many species were teetering on the brink of extinction in the United States, Leopold almost single-handedly developed the art and science of wildlife management. He established a new field, that of game restoration, so that today we can have a balance between agriculture, hunting, fishing, and wildlife. As the last stretches of true wilderness were disappearing, he conceived of the need to preserve a few such remnants intact. The first wilderness area, the Gila Wilderness Preserve, here in southwestern New Mexico, was established at Aldo Leopold's urging in 1924. His genius drove him to keep precise field records, to study the relationships over time of what we now call the ecosystem. As a result, he began to see that nature could no longer be viewed as a static collection of species, but is itself a kind of living organism. And thus was born the subject of field ecology. Although he published numerous technical articles, it was his philosophical and poetic writings contained in a Sand County Almanac, which have that magical quality of all great literature. René Dubos explains.
On the whole, people who talk about the environment talk about it in a sort of vague, abstract, general way, whereas St. County Almanac talks about a particular place, a direct, visual, sensual experience. And in my opinion, this is what has made the book so effective, that instead of discussing environmental problems in the abstract, one relates the problem to a very special situation that one can grasp with one's senses. The environment is not something out there, it's something in which you are, in which you function.
It all began right here in Burlington, Iowa. In this house, on January 11, 1887, Aldo Leopold was born to Karl Leopold, an emigrated German aristocrat, and to Clara Starker Leopold, daughter of a civic and financial leader of Burlington. Aldo grew up atop what is called Prospect Hill. Below was the Mississippi River. Still one of the wildest areas in the continental United States. What better place could there have been for a prospective naturalist to grow up? It was here that the groundwork was laid for his love affair with ornithology. Here that he began his lifelong habit of taking precise field notes. And here that his bent for natural history first expressed itself. At Yale, these predispositions would be solidified into a career choice. Leopold was drawn into the newly emerging field of forestry. Leopold biographer Susan Flader reflects on the Leopold of those early days.
His friends often referred to his German soul, meaning his tendency to think deep thoughts about his experiences in the wild. While in forest school, he became tremendously imbued with timber mechanics, logging, surveying, and other more technical aspects of forestry, so much so that he neglected at times his long tramps of earlier years. But he was very much enthralled by the prospect of a career in the newly created Forest Service.
In 1909, Leopold obtained his forestry degree from Yale. Not surprisingly, his first job was with the U.S. Forestry Service, and it took him to the southwestern United States, to Arizona and New Mexico. And it was here that many of the land ethic principles of his later years evolved. When Leopold arrived, the Southwest was still pioneer country. He had caught up with the frontier. But the Southwest was also a delicately balanced and fragile ecosystem, one susceptible to sudden and dramatic changes. To a keen observer like Leopold, the sudden changes were eye-opening. He was forced to grapple for the first time with the question of man and his progress and its effect on environmental quality. It started with an attempt to preserve big game hunting in the area. This led him to the unmistakable recognition of the human element in the ecosystem and the understanding that little could be done without good public policy and private obligation toward the land. But perhaps most importantly, it led him to the concept of the healthy land organism. And this meant including in the ecosystem predators such as the mountain lions, hawks, and wolves that he once tried to eradicate. He recalled reaching a dying wolf that he had just shot. I was young then and full of trigger itch. I thought that because fewer wolves meant more deer, that no wolves would mean hunter's paradise. But after seeing the green fire in her eyes die, I sensed that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view. Sometime during his New Mexico days, he became one of the minority who saw a diminishing return in a civilization that uses a drained wetland as a symbol of progress. Again, Susan Flatter.
When Leopold wrote Thinking Like a Mountain near the end of his career, he was telescoping into one dramatic instant early in his career, a process of thought that had actually required decades. During the first 10 or 15 years after he moved to Wisconsin, he began to rethink what had been happening in the Southwest and what was continuing to happen. And it wasn't really until the mid to late 30s that Leopold began to come up with the notion of land health, the notion of internal self-adjustment in the biotic community that was to become his hallmark of later years.
In 1924, the same year that the Gila Wilderness area was set aside, Leopold accepted a position in Madison, Wisconsin as Associate Director of the Forest Products Laboratory, the research arm of the Forestry Service. He was 41. After 4 rather frustrating years, he set off on his own, privately pursuing the field that he had created, game management. In 1939, he became a one-man department of wildlife management at the University of Wisconsin. Joe Hickey recalls the Leopold of those early university days.
Professor Leopold was one of the great teachers that we had at this institution. He had a love for young people, and particularly a fascination with new and young ideas. Suppose the thing I need to bring out is that he was a man with a youthful mind, still in his 60s and just bubbling over with enthusiasm about the natural world. And he was a very humble man who never thought of himself as a prophet or a seer or somebody who was going to write these indelible words bringing out the land ethic.
In his relatively short stint at the university, Leopold had an extraordinary influence over his students. And 2 of his most successful students are Frederick and Frances Hammerstrom.
So many teachers are pretentious, and they always seem to be wanting to put you down. And I never knew him to want to put anyone down.
Not anyone.
Well, he meant so much to us in a personal way that it took us years to actually believe that he was dead. And we still are guided by many of his principles. If we have some writing to do or have to give a lecture, we will sometimes think how he lectured or read some of his writing.
He was like a father in the very best sense of the word. Someone you could go to, look up to, talk with, be guided by, and at the same time without any feeling that he was trying to force you into something, push you into something.
And he made us all do certain things that you wouldn't think wildlife biologists would have to do. There wasn't any TV in those days. But we all had to write popular articles. We all had to talk on the radio. We all had to give lectures. He wanted us to be effective people as well as just knowing our field.
A peculiar irony for Leopold was the deer question, which was to plague his entire professional life. The evolution of his thoughts about the environment could be traced by his stands on what to do about the size of deer herds. From his New Mexico attempts to remove deer predators to his last political battle for a doe season in Wisconsin, it represented a change from the notion that more deer is always better to a balanced and healthy ecosystem concept. However, the battle for a doe season left him standing alone, an object of ridicule right up to the time of his death in 1948. Such is often the way of people who are ahead of their times.
Leopold had to answer conservationists who felt that he was simply a killer in advocating that we take down the deer herd and try to reduce the pressure on the land so that we would have a forestry program and not a ecological slum, which our deer herd was beginning to produce in some parts of the state.
But Leopold had a diversion. a place where his thoughts could come together in intellectual maturity. In 1936, he purchased a burnt-out farm in the central sand counties of Wisconsin. By economic standards, it was the poorest region of the state. And yet, it had a special quality that Leopold was to discover as he brought his piece of land back to health. He wrote, "On this sand farm in Wisconsin, first worn out and then abandoned by our bigger and better society, we try to rebuild with shovel and axe what we are losing elsewhere. It is here that we seek and still find our meat from God." The passage is from the book called A Sand County Almanac. It's a book that can change the life of its reader. The first part consists of 12 shack sketches that are the wanderings and observations, seasonally arranged, which emanated from the refurbished chicken coop that the Leopold family called the shack. These sketches are a testimony to the value and the meaning of living in harmony with the land. The shack sketches began in the dead of a Wisconsin winter. This is most appropriate, since not only does January mark the new year for us, it also signals the reawakening of nature's odyssey of yearly events. The squirrels know it, as they mate so that there may be more of their kind. So too the cardinal knows it on that January morning when he lets loose with his first song. Among the group of the year's first events, Leopold had his favorites.
Each year after the midwinter blizzards, there comes a night of thaw when the tinkle of dripping water is heard in the land. It brings strange stirrings, not only to creatures abed for the night, but to some who've been asleep for the winter. The hibernating skunk, curled up in his deep den, uncurls himself and ventures forth to prowl the wet world, dragging his belly in the snow. The track is likely to display an indifference to mundane affairs uncommon in other seasons. It leads across country, as if its maker had hitched his wagon to a star and dropped the reins. I follow. The months of the year, from January up to June, are a geometric progression in the abundance of distractions. In January, one may follow a skunk track or search for bands on the chickadees, with only an occasional and mild digression into other things.
The January thaw is only a temporary respite from winter's grip. And like an eraser, a new snow will soon remove all signs of yesterday's stirrings.
January observation can be almost as simple and peaceful as snow, and almost as continuous as cold. There is time not only to see who has done what, but to speculate why. There are two spiritual dangers in not owning a farm. One is the danger of supposing that breakfast comes from the grocery, and the other that heat comes from the furnace.
It is in dispelling the illusion of the second, supposing that heat comes from the furnace, that Leopold writes what for many is the most memorable part of the shack sketches, the cutting of the good oak.
If one has cut, split, hauled, and piled his own good oak, and let his mind work the while, he'll remember much about where the heat comes from. My dog does not care where heat comes from, but he cares ardently that it come, and soon. Indeed, he considers my ability to make it something magical. Such faith, I suppose, is the kind that moves mountains.
It all started with a 60-year-old oak, which 2 summers before had been struck by lightning, leaving its typical spiral scar. Now seasoned, on a crisp February day, they began to bring down their good oak.
We sensed that our saw was biting its way, stroke by stroke, decade by decade, into the chronology of a lifetime, written in concentric rings of good oak. It took only a dozen pulls of the saw to transect the few years of our ownership, during which we'd learned to love and cherish this farm. Abruptly, we began to cut the years of our predecessor, the bootlegger, who hated this farm. Now our saw bites into the 1920s, the Babbittian decade when everything grew bigger and better in heedlessness and arrogance until 1929, when stock markets crumpled. If the oak heard them fall, the wood gives no sign. Now the saw bites into the teens, the decade of the drainage dream, when steam shovels sucked dry the marshes of central Wisconsin to make farms and made ash heaps instead. We cut 1906, when the first state forester took office, and fires burned 17,000 acres in these sand counties. We cut 1899, when the last passenger pigeon collided with a charge of shot near Babcock, 2 counties to the north. It was in 1890 that the largest pine rafts in history slipped down the Wisconsin River in full view of my oak. Now our saw bites the 1870s. On 10 September 1877, 2 brothers shooting Muskego Lake bagged 210 blue-winged teal in one day. And in 1875, 10 hunters killed 153 prairie chickens at York Prairie. The saw now severs 1865, the pith year of our oak. In that year, John Muir offered to buy from his brother the home farm 30 miles east of my oak. We have cut the core. At last there is a tremor in the great trunk. All hands cry, timber! It's not until the transect is completed that the tree falls, and the stump yields a collective view of a century. By its fall, the tree attests the unity of the hodgepodge called history.
The sand counties begin March still in winter's grip. But the wintering mallards along the river have only a short wait for the sudden explosion of activity that is about to occur. Then it comes. The snow melts, the ponds, rivers, and lakes open up, and in come spring's shock troops. The cranes, ducks, and swans return. And of course, the regal Canada geese return too.
I once knew an educated lady, banded by Phi Beta Kappa, who told me that she'd never heard or seen the geese that twice a year proclaim the revolving seasons to her well-insulated roof. Is education possibly a process of trading awareness for things of lesser worth? The goose who trades his is soon a pile of feathers. A March morning is only as drab as he who walks in it without a glance skyward, ear cocked for geese. They wind the oxbows of the river, cutting low over the now gunless points and islands, and gabbling to each sandbar as to a long-lost friend. They weave low over the marshes and meadows, greeting each newly melted puddle and pool. Finally, after a few pro forma circlings of our marsh, they set wing and glide silently to the pond, black landing gear lowered and rumps white against the far hill. Once touching water, our newly arrived guests set up a honking and splashing that shakes the last thought of winter out of the brittle cattails. Our geese are home again.
In April, after 7 long months of a kind of dormancy, things begin to grow again in the sand counties. Of these early happenings, the blooming of the draba, the smallest flower, has for most people gone unnoticed.
He who hopes for spring with upturned eye never sees so small a thing as draba. He who despairs of spring with downcast eyes steps on it unknowing. He who searches for spring with his knees in the mud finds it in abundance. Draba plucks no heartstrings. Its perfume, if there is any, is lost in the gusty winds. Its color is plain white, wears a sensible woolly coat. Nothing eats it, it's too small. After all, it is no spring flower, but only a postscript to a hope.
April in the sand counties once had a very different look to it. It was the time of the great prairie fires. Then the bur oak stood like a lonely sentry overlooking the vast grasslands.
Bur oak is the only tree that can stand up to a prairie fire and live. You ever wondered why a thick crust of corky bark covers the whole tree, even to the smallest twigs? This cork is armor. Bur oaks were the shock troops sent by the invading forest to storm the prairie. Fire is what they had to fight. Each April, before the new grasses had covered the prairie with unburnable greenery, fires ran at will over the land, sparing only such old oaks as had grown bark too thick to scorch.
But in the 1840s, the fires stopped and the region took on a new look. All that the fires had taken care of grew up.
Seedling oaks forthwith romped over the grasslands in legions, and what had been the prairie region became a region of woodlot farms. All the bur oaks, except the oldest veterans, date back to the 1850s and the 1860s, and this was when fires ceased on the prairie. Thus, he who owns a veteran bur oak owns more than a tree. He owns a historical library and a reserved seat in the theater of evolution.
By May, the March-blooming maples have converted the first flowers of the year into green and red whirligigs. And all over the sand counties, the parade of blooms has moved into high gear. Trilliums in wooded areas. Jacob's ladder and wild plums along the edges burst forth. Lupines, puccoons, and wild indigo in the open sandy prairies set their plumes. And the ubiquitous red oak undergo their special metamorphosis. As far as the plants are concerned, the transformation is completed in May. It's spring. It's also the time that many birds begin their nesting, including Leopold's beloved ruffed grouse. The last thrust of migrating birds passes through in May, and the savanna sparrows and bobolinks are joined by the upland plover in their pseudo-prairies.
When dandelions have set the mark of May on Wisconsin pastures, it's time to listen for the final proof of spring. Sit down on a tussock, cock your ears at the sky, dial out the bedlam of meadowlarks and redwings, and soon you may hear it, the flight song of the upland plover, just now back from the Argentine. Just watch. Soon a flash of silver will tell you that the plover has alighted and folded his long wings. Whoever invented the word grace must have seen the wing folding of the plover. There he sits. His whole being says it's your next move to absent yourself from his domain. The county records may allege that you own this pasture, but the plover airily rules out such trivial legalities. He has just flown 4,000 miles to reassert the title he got from the Indians, and until the young plovers are a wing, this pasture is his, and none may trespass without his protest. The upland plover fits easily into the agricultural countryside. He follows the black and white buffalo, which now pasture his prairies, and finds them an acceptable substitute for brown ones. There was a time in the early 1900s when Wisconsin farms nearly lost their immemorial timepiece. Universal gunpowder, plus the lure of plover on toast for post-Victorian banquets, had taken too great a toll. The belated protection of the federal migratory bird laws came just in time.
Hot, humid, and green. Sometime in early June, all thoughts of cool breezes are gone for the next 4 months. Hidden in the succulent greenery are hungry mouths, eager to be fed, such as these red-winged chicks that lie upside down in their nest. What they wait for are insects. In June, there's an explosion of insects. It's a world of visual beauty. When the great hatches of insects occur, every fisherman knows that it's time to head for his favorite trout stream. On those torrid June days, when waders feel like hot tar paper, there's a refreshing of the soul for those who fish Leopold's idyllic Alder Fork.
This, we now remembered, was a stream of parts. High up near the headwaters, we'd once seen a fork, narrow, deep, and fed by cold springs, that gurgled out under its close-hemmed walls of alder. What would a self-respecting trout do in such weather? Just what we did. Go up. A trout was rising just upstream. I paid out some line, wishing it would always stay thus soft and dry, and measuring the distance with a false cast or two, laid down a spent gnat exactly a foot above his last swirl. Forgotten now with the hot miles, the mosquitoes. How like fish we are. Ready, nay, eager to seize upon whatever new things some wind of circumstance shakes down the river of time. And how we rue our haste, finding the gilded morsel to contain a hook. Even so, I think there's some virtue in eagerness, whether its object prove true or false. How utterly dull would be a wholly prudent man, or trout, or world. Did I say a while ago that I waited for prudence' sake? That was not so. The only prudence in fishermen is that designed to set the stage for taking yet another and perhaps a longer chance.
As for the fish that I caught on the Alder Fork,
I shall now confess to you that none of those 3 trout had to be beheaded or folded double to fit their casket. What was big was not the trout, but the chance. What was full was not my creed, but my memory. "120 acres, according to the county clerk, is the extent of my worldly domain. But the county clerk is a sleepy fellow who never looks at his record books before 9 o'clock. What they would show at daybreak is the question here at issue. Books or no books, it is a fact that at daybreak I am the sole owner of all the acres I can walk over. It is not only boundaries that disappear, but also the thought of being bounded. Expanses unknown to deed or map are known to every dawn, and solitude, supposed no longer to exist in my county, extends on every hand as far as the dew can reach. I can feel the sun now. The bird chorus has run out of breath. A tractor roars warning that my neighbor is astir. The world is shrunk to those mean dimensions known to county clerks. We turn toward home and breakfast.
at one time, much of the Sand Counties was covered by prairie, and July was a spectacular time for an observer of those virgin prairies as they burst into bloom. Because most of the prairie has disappeared, every remaining acre is like a torn page from a great history book.
The outstanding conservator of the prairie flora, ironically enough, knows little and cares less about such frivolities. It is the railroad with its fenced right-of-way.
Leopold was particularly fond of the compass plant, wherever one could be found on one of those remaining railroad prairie relics. For an individual plant may be over 100 years old.
Heretofore unreachable by scythe or mower, this relic of original Wisconsin gives birth each July to a man-high stalk of compass plant, or cut-leaf silphium, spangled with saucer-sized yellow blooms resembling sunflowers. What 1,000 acres of silphiums looked like when they tickled the bellies of the buffalo is a question never again to be answered, and perhaps not even asked. Few grieved when the last buffalo left Wisconsin, and few will grieve when the last silphium follows him to the lush prairies of the Never Never Land.
Cutting through the heart of the Sand Counties is one of the great rivers of the world, the Wisconsin River. Leopold knew the shifting subtleties of this great river well, for his Sand County farm rests on its banks. A great river is an ecosystem unto itself, and at no time is this more apparent on the Wisconsin River than in August. This is when the river shrinks into its main channel, creating beautiful pools, sloughs, and sandbars. The previously barren floodplain springs to life, equaled only by the desert bloom after a rain. Each year, there's a new creation. Leopold likened it to a masterpiece painting.
It is the river who wields the brush, and it is the same river who, before I can bring my friends to view his work, erases it forever from human view. After that, it exists only in my mind's eye. Like other artists, my river is temperamental. There's no predicting when the mood to paint will come upon him, or how long it will last. But in midsummer, when the great white fleets cruise the sky for day after flawless day, it is worth the strolling down to the sandbars just to see whether he's been at work. The work begins with a broad ribbon of silt brushed thinly on the sand of a receding shore. When I see the silt ribbon turning green with Eleucharis, I watch closely thereafter, for this is the sign that the river is in a painting mood. At this stage, the seedlings of plants too numerous to count and too young to recognize spring to life from the damp, warm sand under the green ribbon. Here and there, a cardinal flower thrusts a red spear skyward. At the head of the bar, purple ironweeds and pale pink jopais stand tall against the wall of willows. And if you have come quietly and humbly, as you should to any spot that can be beautiful only once, you may surprise a fox-red deer standing knee-high in the garden of his delight. In your mind, you may hang up your picture and hope that in some other summer the mood to paint may come upon the river.
Leopold writes of the worth of a dozen risings in the dark in the hope of hearing the chorus of quail and being party to other elusive morning events.
By September, the day breaks with little help from birds. A song sparrow may give a single, half-hearted song. A woodcock may twitter overhead en route to his daytime thicket. A barred owl may terminate the night's argument with one last wavering call. But few other birds have anything to say or sing about. In June, it is completely predictable that the robin will give voice when the light intensity reaches 0.01 candle power, and that the bedlam of other singers will follow in predictable sequence. In autumn, on the other hand, the robin is silent, and it is quite unpredictable whether the covey chorus will occur at all.
But even without the success of hearing the covey chorus, the early morning rising has its lasting rewards.
Somehow the blue autumnal needles on those pines became thenceforth bluer, and the red carpet of dewberry under those pines became even redder.
October is a special month.
I sometimes think that the other months were constituted mainly as a fitting interlude between Octobers, and I suspect that dogs, and perhaps grouse, share the same view.
It is the month for hunting. Hunting never had a more eloquent defender than Aldo Leopold. Not the crazy mechanized thing that it can become today, but that solitary experience that brings us face to face with our pre-city heritage.
Hunts differ in flavor, but the reasons are subtle. The sweetest hunts are stolen. To steal a hunt, either go far into the wilderness where no one has been, or else find some undiscovered place under everybody's nose.
His favorite was grouse hunting in Adams County, when the tamaracks turned smoky gold. Of course, in the company of a dog that knows what is grouseward better than you do.
Few hunters know that grouse exist in Adams County, for when they drive through it, they see only a waste of jack pines and scrub oaks. Here, come October, I sit in the solitude of my tamaracks and hear the hunters' cars roaring up the highway, hell-bent for the crowded counties to the north. One way to hunt partridge is to make a plan based on logic and probabilities of the terrain to be hunted. Another way is to wander quite aimlessly from one red lantern to another. This will likely take you where the birds actually are. The lanterns are blackberry leaves, red in October sun.
It's a good hunting dog that will lead the way through the river of red.
Along the little boggy streams of these friendly wastes, called poor by those whose own lights barely flicker, the blackberries burn richly red on every sunny day from first frost to the last day of the season. Every woodcock and every partridge has his private solarium under these briars. Most hunters, not knowing this, wear themselves out in the briarless scrub, and returning home birdless, leave the rest of us in peace. By us, I mean the birds, the stream, the dog, and myself. The October breeze brings my dog many scents other than grouse, each of which may lead to its own peculiar episode. Almost anything may happen between one red lantern and another.
For the sand counties, November is truly a month of transition. Gone is the last vestige of summer. The fall-colored leaves have all settled to the ground, and the naked limbs await the first transforming snow. In this stark scene, the wind is the main actor.
The wind that makes music in November corn is in a hurry. The stalks hum, the loose husks whisk skyward in half-playful swirls, and the wind hurries on. In the marsh, long, windy waves surge across the grassy sloughs, beat against the far willows. A tree strives to argue, bare limbs waving, but there is no detaining the wind. On the sandbar, there is only wind, and the river sliding seaward. Every wisp of grass is drawing circles on the sand. I wander over the bar to a driftwood log, where I sit and listen to the universal roar, the tinkle of wavelets on the shore. The river is lifeless. Not a duck, heron, marsh hawk, or gull has sought refuge from wind.
November is also the time to survey your land, to see what has happened over the past year. The naked trees of November have many stories to tell.
Every farm woodland, in addition to yielding lumber, fuel, and posts, should provide its owner a liberal education. This crop of wisdom never fails, but it's not always harvested. These writings are a record of some of the many lessons I have learned in my own woods.
The year ends much as it began on the wind-swept sand counties, snow-covered and cold. By the first week in December, there is no longer any doubt that winter, as central Wisconsin knows it, has returned. The smells so prevalent just a month ago are frozen in the ground. A bird calling, any sound of life, is once again the exception to the numbing silence of a winter sunset, far in the southwest.
It is in midwinter that I sometimes glean from my pines something more important than woodlot politics and the news of the wind and weather. This is especially likely to happen on some gloomy evening when the snow has buried all irrelevant detail and the hush of elemental sadness lies heavy upon every living thing. Nevertheless, my pines, each with his burden of snow, are standing ramrod straight, rank upon rank, and in the dusk beyond I sense the presence of hundreds more. At such times I feel a curious transfusion of courage.
In his essay on leisure, Leopold quoted Ariosto. How miserable are the idle hours of an ignorant man. One of the ways Leopold filled his leisure time was to band birds that gathered around the old shack in winter.
To band a bird is to hold a ticket in a great lottery. It is an exercise in objectivity to hold a ticket on the banded sparrow that falleth, or on the banded chickadee that may someday re-enter your trap, and thus prove that he is still alive. But to the old-timer, the banding of new birds becomes merely pleasant routine. The real thrill lies in the recapture of some bird banded long ago, some bird whose age, adventures, and previous condition of appetite are perhaps better known to you than to the bird himself.
One such bird was a chickadee, simply called by his band, 65290. It was a chickadee that by its fifth winter was the sole survivor of his generation.
I know so little about birds that I can only speculate on why 65290 survived his fellows. Was he more clever in dodging his enemies? What enemies? The chickadee is almost too small to have any. It seems likely that weather is the only killer so devoid of both humor and dimension as to kill a chickadee. I suspect that in a chickadee's Sunday school, two mortal sins are taught. Thou shalt not venture into windy places in winter, and thou shalt not get wet before a blizzard.
And so the learning and healing of the land would go on for another year. Unlike ancient prophets, Aldo Leopold had no mountain to climb. Instead, he walked his Sand County farm. He watched, he listened, he wrote down what he discovered, and he thought and analyzed until at last he became environmentally educated. He understood. But what he saw was not always pleasant. As he wrote, one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Leopold also understood that we could not heal land by government proxy. The changes that could bring about land health would have to come from within us. It is all laid out in his famous essay, A Land Ethic. When godlike Odysseus returned from the wars in Troy, he hanged all on one rope a dozen slave girls of his household, whom he suspected of misbehavior during his absence. This hanging involved no question of propriety. The girls were property. The disposal of property was then, as now, a matter of expediency, not of right and wrong. During the 3,000 years which have since elapsed, ethical criteria have been extended to many fields of conduct. But there is as yet no land ethic dealing with man's relation to land and to the animals and plants which grow upon it. Land, like Odysseus' slave girls, is still property. The land relation is still strictly economic, entailing privileges, but not obligations. All ethics so far evolved rest upon a single premise, that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively, the land. This sounds simple. Do we not already sing out love for and obligation to the land of the free and the home of the brave? Yes, but just what and whom do we love? Certainly not the soil, which we are sending helter-skelter downriver. Certainly not the waters, which we assume have no function except to turn turbines, float barges, and carry off sewage. Certainly not the plants of which we exterminate whole communities without batting an eye. Certainly not the animals, of which we've already extirpated many of the largest and most beautiful species. A land ethic, of course, cannot prevent the alteration, management, and use of these resources, but it does affirm their right to continued existence. In short, a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also respect for the community as such. Oh, yes. And how well have we heeded the words of Aldo Leopold? Not well enough. David Brower.
The land ethic is a concept that still escapes most people in this country. I think that we need to hear Aldo Leopold again and again. We need a Sand County Almanac and other excerpts of his writings readily at hand, brought to light repeatedly. I don't think anyone is going to write better what he's already said. He had a basic humor in it that will catch public attention. We just have to get it out before them. The land ethic is evolving, it is recovering, it has a long way to go, and we'd better hurry.